On behalf of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory, 3CT, I'm Lisa Wadeen, and it's an honor to welcome you and to introduce you to today's speaker, my dear friend and extraordinary scholar, Professor Nadia Abu El-Haj. Before getting started, I want to thank 3CT's Associate Director, Anna Searle-Jones, for her help in organizing this gathering at a moment's notice and for everything she does to make 3CT work. We at 3CT are also indebted to Ryan Eckholt and to our two student assistants, Heather Welty and Delaney Wallace. Thank you to all of you. This is one of 3CT's pop-up talks, an effort to shed light on current events to theorize the present without being presentist. Now, a few remarks about our speaker, Professor Nadia Abu El-Haj. Professor El-Haj Abu El-Haj is Anne Whitney Olin Professor in the Departments of Anthropology at Barnard College and Columbia University, co-director of the Center for Palestine Studies, and chair of the governing board of the Society of Fellows Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia University. She also serves as vice president and vice chair of the board at the Institute for Palestine Studies in Washington, D.C., the recipient of numerous awards, including from the Social Science Research Council, the Wenner-Gren Foundation, the MacArthur Foundation, the Harvard Academy for Area and International Studies, the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton, and the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. She is the author of numerous journal articles published on topics ranging from the history of archaeology in Palestine to the question of race and genomics, to the salience of trauma narratives for US militarism today. Abu El-Haj has published 3 books, Facts on the Ground, Archaeological Practice, and Territorial Self-Fashioning in Israeli Society. That's University of Chicago Press, 2001, which won the Albert Harani Annual Book Award from the Middle East Studies Association in 2002. The Genealogical Science, The Search for Jewish Origins, and the Politics of Epistemology, University of Chicago Press, 2012. And last but not least, Combat Trauma, Imaginaries of War and Citizenship in Post-9/11 America, Versu, 2022. The latter book will be the subject of a 3CT book salon with discussant Professor Julian Go from the Department of Sociology on October 24th. Combat Trauma is an indictment of US militarism, taking as its focus the field of military psychiatry. The book illuminates the complex ethical and political implications of the shifting psychiatric and public understandings of what counts as trauma. So please mark your calendars for 5 p.m. on October 24th. That's in the Social Sciences Tea Room? Great. Today, though, Professor Abu El-Haj, who will give a brief talk entitled Settler Colonialism and the Question of Palestine, followed by a Q&A and then a reception with food for more informal conversation. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming her during these troubled times.
Okay, so when I agreed to do this 2 days ago, because I was actually just going to be here, I imagined a small discussion with, 20 people. So thank you for having me, Lisa, and I may strangle my close friend for getting me into this. So let me just begin by saying, look, this has been a really hard week for a lot of people. I want to acknowledge that before. I swear I didn't do anything. And what follows, or what I've sort of prepared, isn't really a formal talk. It's some thoughts I'm having about what's going on and the responses and whatever, a kind of framing conversation. So I will begin. Okay. So I want to begin with an analogy that we have been called upon to recognize since last Saturday. The attack on Israel this past weekend has been called Israel's 9/11 moment. What does that designation invoke, at least for those of us, not just in the US, but more generally in the global north? the horror of the mass killing of civilians, the feeling of vulnerability that we aren't really used to. But I want to suggest that it invokes and that it intends to invoke far more than that. It is a call for unconditional support for what is to follow. If this is Israel's 9/11 moment, we would do well to hear that referent not so much as a call for solidarity, but as a cautionary tale. Following the attacks on New York, there was no space to ask questions, to introduce any historical context into the conversation, or to question US imperial power as it operates across the world and the wars that the US launched. That was out of bounds for many years to come. Let me quote from an op-ed written by Phil Cly, a novelist and a veteran of the post-9/11 wars. This op-ed was published in the New York Times on the eve of the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban in August 2021. And I quote, "9/11 unified America. It overcame partisan divides, bound us together, and gave us the sense of common purpose so lacking in today's poisonous politics. And nothing we have done as a nation since has been so catastrophically destructive as what we did when we were enraptured by the warm glow of victimization and felt like we could do anything together," unquote. I am not making an analogy here between Hamas and Al-Qaeda. What I am saying is this: history did not begin on 9/11, and it did not begin this past weekend with an unprecedented incursion, Hamas incursion into what is called Israel proper, in which, in addition to military personnel, hundreds of civilians were killed. Those civilian casualties were just the beginning, of course, of what is to come. In the words of Israel's defense minister, quote, "This is Israel's 9/11, and Israel would do anything to bring our sons and daughters back home. There is no reconciling with genocidal terrorists. Israel will exact a heavy price on Hamas so that what we witnessed will never repeat itself." The price is not being exacted on Hamas, of course, but on the entire population, 2.4 million people in Gaza, who have no bomb shelters to go to and who have nowhere to go. And yet, in contrast to the response to the brutal violence that unfolded inside Israel over the weekend, there is virtual radio silence in the press, but most especially among the political leadership of this country and throughout Europe about the brutality now unfolding in Gaza. In fact, the US is lining up weaponry and its ships to make sure Israel can finish the job. So how do we situate, historically and politically, the Hamas operation? Before getting into recent history, I want to start at the beginning, so to speak. Who are the residents of Gaza? The vast majority are refugees from the War of 48. More specifically, most are refugees from southern Palestine, that is, including the areas where the Hamas incursion took place. Those were Palestinian towns and villages prior to 1948. To move to more recent times, given that Gaza has been closed, that is, subjected to a military blockade since 2007, most Gazans alive today have never left the Strip, the Gaza Strip. To quote Francesca Albanese, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Israel has kept Gaza, and I'm quoting now, Gaza's population captive in an air, naval, and ground blockade for 16 years, with regular large-scale military offensives that even before the current offensive have left over 4,200 dead, including 1,124 children and hundreds of thousands homeless, unquote. And let's be clear what a blockade means. Not just that virtually no one can leave, but that the Israeli state controls what goes in: concrete, food, fuel, water, electricity. Half the population of Gaza is under 18. They are, to return to Albanese's words, quote, "children of the blockade and constant war," unquote. They have never, in other words, known anything else. This is an open-air prison, by any measure illegal under international law, And it is an open-air prison that the international community, by which we should be honest, really refers to the global north, has suborned and stood behind. So let me now move to the occupied West Bank, in which I include East Jerusalem. In contrast to Gaza, the West Bank is subjected to an ever-expansive settlement project. Israel has not simply withdrawn and blockaded the territory. Instead, land grabs and de facto annexation proceed apace. Note the following data, and I'm quoting from a report from Peace Now, the Israeli peace organization. Quote, at the time of the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, there were approximately 110,000 settlers in the West Bank and around 140,000 in East Jerusalem. In the West Bank, there were 128 settlements, and in East Jerusalem, the settlement activity was concentrated in 12 large neighborhoods, mostly built in the 70s and 80s, such as Gilo, Piskat Ze'ev, and Ramot, and others. 30 years later, there are about 465,000 settlers in the West Bank, up from 140,000, residing in and around 300 settlements and outposts versus 125, right? In East Jerusalem, I'm still quoting, there are approximately 230,000 settlers, in addition to about 3,000 who are residing within Palestinian neighborhoods in East Jerusalem, unquote. In other words, Palestinians find themselves not just increasingly stripped of land, they are increasingly enclosed. Meanwhile, for years now, settlers have gone on violent rampages. There are the so-called price tag attacks, that is, settlers exacting a price from the local Palestinian population for any action taken against their settlement enterprise by the state. And as the Israeli governments have moved further and further to the right, in other words, as there has been increasingly almost no brakes at all put on the settlement project, and let's be clear, there were always only ever partial brakes, the settlers, who are functionally often inseparable from the IDF, seem to have gained a carte blanche for inflicting violence and terror. Think the attack on Hawara on the 26th of February this year, what some Jewish Israeli critics referred to as a pogrom. The military stood aside, protecting, one might presume, the settlers' right to rampage. On July 3rd, the IDF laid siege to the Jenin refugee camp and effectively reduced it to rubble. No attention was paid to the lives of civilians or their homes in the assault. And those are only the spectacles of violence that we see, not the everyday brutality that flies under the radar, at least among those of us who are audiences watching from afar. This past year has seen at least one Palestinian, most often a child or a teenager, killed every day in the West Bank. Perhaps when it happens every day, rather than all at once, it's harder to recognize it as a massacre, but the effect over time is the same. Understanding the conditions under which Palestinians live is not only a matter of recognizing kinetic violence, however. There are other forms of violence, what scholars have called slow violence, that destroy communities, environments, and people's very capacity to live anything resembling a normal life. Violence, that is neither spectacle nor event. That is the largest context through which one needs to think about both the Hamas incursion and the widespread support it has received among Palestinian communities. All major international Palestinian and Israeli human rights organizations declared a few years ago that Israel is an apartheid state. I will quote from Amnesty International. Israel imposes a system of oppression and domination against Palestinians across all areas under its control, in Israel and the OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territories, and against Palestinian refugees in order to benefit Jewish Israelis. This amounts to apartheid as prohibited in international law. Laws, policies, and practices which are intended to maintain a cruel system of control over Palestinians have left them fragmented geographically and politically, frequently impoverished, and in a constant state of fear and insecurity, unquote. But I want to go further. In relation to the West Bank, it might be better to describe Israeli rule, in addition to apartheid, as a military dictatorship. There is no civil law for Palestinians, only military courts. There is indefinite detention without trial. Their military and settler killings go uninvestigated, and even when investigated, largely unpunished. In other words, this is martial law. So what is the point of all this? In part, its context. Where did anyone think this would end? Can one really operate this expansive a system of oppression, a military siege over Gaza, a military dictatorship over the West Bank, and not expect a return of the repressed, so to speak? Armed resistance is both legitimate and inevitable. Also inevitable, perhaps, are the excesses, and yes, I will say it, the war crimes we witnessed over the weekend. But I want to ask, where is the outrage over the excesses which are built into the very structure of Israeli rule, that is, the very conditions of military rule that have been ongoing for decades? I'm reminded of Talal Assad's extended essay on suicide bombing. Why do only some forms of violence, certain killings, elicit such disgust and horror in the West? These are human animals, as one Israeli official declared after the weekend, and we will treat them as such. Israel has cut off food, fuel, water, and electricity to Gaza. I want you to pause over that. Food, fuel, water, and electricity. That is, by any measure, a war crime. These are war crimes the global North seems more than happy to stand behind. No one seems to be willing to call Israel to account. A paradigm shift. Over the past several days, we've been hearing a lot about whether this represents a paradigm shift. That is, a shift away from the idea that you can coop up 2.4 million people in an open-air prison, that more broadly you can treat an entire people the way Israel has treated Palestinians in the West Bank and elsewhere, and expect stability and calm. In fact, there was a headline in the New York Times that said Israel no longer believes that no longer sees that Hamas is a possible source of stability in Gaza, as if Gaza was stable. That, what's more, the assumption has been that the normalization of relationships with myriad and authoritarian Arab regimes is the way forward, that the question of Palestine can be set aside. I'm not so sure that such a recognition is forthcoming, in other words, the radical paradigm shift that people are hoping or to see or predicting. But I do want to call upon us to consider the need for a paradigm shift of a different order, one that might, in fact, be foundational to that other one. Over the many months now, at least until this past weekend, the Jewish Israeli public has been deeply divided over a proposed and now enacted judicial overhaul. After months of massive protests on July 4th, 2023, the Israeli Knesset passed a bill that eliminated the reasonableness standard. That is, an Anglo-legal concept that grants the High Court discretion to strike down government decisions and appointments it deems unreasonable. The first step in a broader judicial overhaul championed by the most right-wing regime or coalition in Israeli history, the entire opposition, 56 members of the Knesset, boycotted the vote. According to the New York Times, among many other English and Hebrew language publications, this bill and the larger judicial overhaul of which it is a part threatens to undermine Israeli democracy. In months-long massive protests that rocked the Israeli streets, we were told over and over again, the state's secular and liberal citizens are fighting to save their liberal democratic state. Descriptions in the US press and elsewhere have situated this Israeli political crisis squarely within the more general shift towards right-wing and fascist and proto-fascist, anti-democratic political movements throughout the Euro-American world. In other words, the sort of characterization of the right-wing coalition. Thinking from my home in New York, the slide into illiberalism and the threats to democratic institutions are on full display here at home and not just elsewhere. And yet, I want to insist, we need to reframe what unfolded in Israeli politics over the past several years. Its shift to the right should not be integrated, and certainly not seamlessly, into the larger global trend. Israel is not and has never been a democratic state. Israel is not the state of its citizens. As a Jewish state, a fundamental distinction cleaves the contours of citizenship. While upon its establishment, the state declared it would protect the religious and cultural rights of its minorities, Israel was established as the national home of the Jewish people, wherever they reside in the world. Today, with approximately 20% of its citizenry Palestinian, with its military rule over nearly 5 million Palestinian subjects who enjoy none of the rights or protections of even an unequal citizenship, and with 68% of Palestinian refugees with no right of return, with no rights at all, that foundational principle endures. And more than endure, in July 2018, the Israeli Knesset passed a new basic law, which is the equivalent of kind of a constitutional claim, that enshrines Israel as, quote, the nation state of the Jewish people, unquote. Among other provisions, the law states that, quote, the right to exercise national self-determination in Israel is unique to the Jewish people. What's more, it declares, quote, the state views the development of Jewish settlement as a national value and will act to encourage and promote its establishment and consolidation, unquote. In response to legal challenges that argued the law to be racist and anti-democratic that was brought by various Israeli civil rights groups in 2021 to the High Court, that very court purportedly essential to safeguarding Israel's democratic character, the court ruled it constitutional. That is, one presumes, reasonable. Israel should not be described as a democracy, however imperfect, now under threat for the right, as it has been described in the New York Times. Structural racism is not unique to the Israeli state, of course, but in comparison to those Euro-American liberal democracies to which Israel is generally compared, there's a cardinal, material difference. Racial inequality is written into the law. What's more, it's written into two separate legal regimes, one civil and one military, both of which differentially govern Palestinian and Jewish citizens and subjects, or Palestinian subjects, who reside in territories under the state's control. Sorry. The vast majority of Jewish Israelis protesting against the judicial overhaul have been worried primarily about threats to their own rights as secular liberals, as women, as LGBTQ plus persons. What is more, the protest leaders did their best to exclude any signs of Palestinian identity and politics from the demonstrations that had occurred. The occupation bloc was by and large kept out. Whatever the soul of Israel's liberal democracy refers to, it did not include Palestinians and the myriad political demands and imaginaries that comprise Palestinian politics. In a speech before the Knesset in advance of the vote on the reasonableness standard, the Minister of Justice, Yariv Levin, listed 5 government decisions the High Court had struck down using that standard. All of them, quote, and this is from an Israeli journalist, were about Palestinians and the occupation, unquote. As Ben Reif reports, this should come as no surprise. Levin has spoken previously about the need to, quote, diminish the power of the judiciary, unquote, in order to realize the annexation of the occupied territories. In short, as this journalist puts it, this is the, quote, judicial overhaul's endgame, unquote. Immediately upon Hamas's incursion into Israeli territory, those who argued they would not do their reserve duty under the command of this right-wing regime put aside their objections and joined the fight. There are divisions, however, still being voiced and accusations still being thrown around by Israel's secular, liberal Jewish citizens. The reasons Hamas could breach the barrier so easily is that entire army brigades had been moved from the border to the West Bank in order to protect settlers. That the state may well decide to sacrifice the hostages Hamas took into Gaza because they come largely from Ashkenazi settler communities and not the religious nationalist ones that dominate the government, although now the government is a unity coalition. That was something I heard a few days ago. Or as I saw on Twitter today, a doctor and presumably relative of an injured Israeli civilian screamed at the right-wing Minister of Environmental Protection Edith Slimane, who I assume came to the hospital to console those who had been injured. And I'm just quoting from the film, from the clip. "You've ruined the country. Get out of here. Now it's our turn. We'll govern here," unquote. But those divisions lead nowhere until the fundamental and foundational violence of the Israeli state and its contemporary iterations come front and center. The question of Palestine has to be resolved, and it has to be resolved justly. There is no other exit ramp here.